The Christmas Morning Sleigh Ride. Welcome back to Mindful Musings, where we explore stories that stir the soul and challenge the mind. I'm your host, William, and today we're stepping into the snow-covered village of St. Mary Mead for a Christmas mystery that will chill you more than the winter frost. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. Drop a comment and let me know your corner of the world. Now, let's join Miss Marple as she unravels a holiday tragedy. Let's get started. Chapter 1. A Village Tradition in Snow. Christmas morning in St. Mary Mead arrived with the gift every villager had been hoping for. Snow. Not the light dusting that barely whitened the rooftops, but a proper snowfall that had begun on Christmas Eve and continued through the night, transforming the village into something from a Victorian greeting card. By dawn, 2 feet of pristine white covered the countryside, and the ancient tradition could proceed as planned. Miss Jane Marple stood at her cottage window, watching the early morning light catch the snow crystals like scattered diamonds across her garden. At 73, she had seen many Christmas mornings, but the sight of fresh snow never failed to stir something childlike within her. Today was special for another reason. Sir Edmund Blackstone's annual sleigh ride, a tradition he had maintained for 15 years since purchasing Blackstone Manor and its sprawling estate. The sleigh itself was a marvel, a genuine Victorian piece that Sir Edmund had restored at considerable expense. Painted deep green with gold trim, it featured ornate scrollwork and upholstered seats in crimson velvet. The matched pair of grey horses that pulled it, Thunder and Lightning, were magnificent creatures that seemed to enjoy the spectacle as much as the passengers. Sir Edmund had purchased them as matched foals and trained them specifically for pulling the sleigh, and their grey coats gleamed like silver in the winter sunlight. The tradition had become one of the village's most beloved Christmas events. 20 villagers would be selected each year to participate, riding in groups of 4 throughout the morning. The route took them through the most picturesque parts of the estate, past ancient oaks draped in snow, along the frozen stream that wound through the property, and up to the high meadow where one could see across 3 counties on a clear day. Miss Marple had been invited to participate in the second group, alongside Mrs. Clement from the vicarage, young Pippa Morton, who taught at the village school, and elderly Colonel Bantry. They had gathered at 9 o'clock at the manor's front gates, where Sir Edmund himself had greeted them warmly, his breath forming clouds in the crisp air. He wore a heavy wool coat with a red muffler, looking every inch the benevolent country squire as he helped each passenger into the sleigh. The ride had been magical. Thomas Fletcher, the estate manager, drove the sleigh with practiced skill while Christmas carols played from speakers mounted discreetly on the vehicle. Fletcher was a man who seemed born to work outdoors, his weathered face speaking of decades spent in all weathers, his hands steady and capable on the reins. He knew every inch of the estate, having managed it since Sir Edmund's purchase 15 years ago. They had glided through snow-laden woods where branches hung heavy with white, past the frozen ornamental pond where swans stood like statues, and along the ancient stone wall that marked the estate's eastern boundary. The wall itself dated back to 1847, built of local limestone and featuring elaborately carved boundary stones at regular intervals. Miss Marple noted these details with the careful attention she brought to all observations, storing each piece of information in the well-organized filing system of her mind. The sleigh bells jingled merrily as Thunder and Lightning pulled them effortlessly through the deep snow. Their breath created twin clouds that drifted back toward the passengers, carrying the warm smell of horses. The runners made a pleasant hissing sound as they cut through the powder, and occasionally a branch would release its burden of snow with a soft whoosh, creating miniature blizzards that sparkled in the morning light. Miss Marple had observed everything with her characteristic attention to detail. The way the horses' hooves created a rhythmic pattern in the snow, how the runners left parallel tracks behind them, the precise route Fletcher followed along paths he clearly knew intimately. She noticed how he navigated around certain areas where drifts had formed, how he kept the horses to a steady pace that was exhilarating without being dangerous, how he timed their progress to coordinate with the musical selections playing from the speakers. Colonel Bantry, who had ridden in similar sleighs during his military service in Canada many years ago, commented favourably on Fletcher's skill. Fine driver, that man. Knows his business. These horses trust him completely. You can tell by the way they respond to the reins. Mrs. Clement had been delighted by the experience, her usual reserve melting in the face of such festive magic. Even practical Pippa Morton, who usually approached life with sensible skepticism, had laughed with pure joy as they crested the hill and saw the valley spread below them like a scene from a snow globe. It had all seemed perfectly ordinary, perfectly safe, perfectly festive. The kind of Christmas morning tradition that would be remembered fondly and recounted to grandchildren in years to come. Now, back at her cottage preparing her Christmas dinner, Miss Marple reflected on the morning's pleasure. Her small turkey was in the oven, filling the cottage with savoury aromas. She had prepared vegetables from her garden, stored carefully in her cellar through the autumn months, and a Christmas pudding that she'd made weeks ago was waiting to be steamed. It would be a quiet Christmas dinner, as her nephew Raymond was spending the holiday with his wife's family this year, but she didn't mind. The memories of the sleigh ride would provide pleasant company. There would be 3 more groups taking their turns, with Sir Edmund himself riding in the final sleigh alongside his secretary Dorothy Hayes, business partner Marcus Webb, and Fletcher. She imagined them preparing now, perhaps sharing a warming drink before the last journey. Sir Edmund always reserved the final ride for himself and his closest associates, a privilege of hosting that no one begrudged him, given his generosity in sharing the tradition with the village. She had no way of knowing that within 2 hours Sir Edmund Blackstone would be dead, and the joyful Christmas tradition would become the scene of what she would come to recognise as a carefully planned murder. The snow that had brought such beauty to St. Mary Mead would become the concealing blanket for violence, and the Victorian sleigh that had carried passengers in celebration would deliver a man to his death. Chapter 2. Death on a Snowy Slope. The telephone rang at precisely 11:45, interrupting Miss Marple as she basted her small turkey. It was Dr. Haydock, his usually jovial voice tight with urgency. "Jane, I'm afraid there's been a terrible accident at Blackstone Manor. Sir Edmund is dead. Inspector Slack is here and wondered if you might come up to the house. Your group was on the sleigh this morning, and he'll want statements from everyone." Miss Marple felt a cold sensation that had nothing to do with the weather. "Of course, Doctor. I'll come immediately." She hung up the telephone and stood for a moment in her small kitchen, absorbing the shock. Sir Edmund dead, on Christmas morning, during the sleigh ride that had brought such joy just hours earlier. She removed her apron with steady hands, though her mind was already racing through possibilities. An accident during the ride itself? A medical emergency? Something more sinister? She bundled herself into her warmest coat, wrapped a thick scarf around her neck, and pulled on her fur-lined boots. The walk to Blackstone Manor would take 20 minutes through the snow, but she needed the time to compose her thoughts and prepare herself for what she might find. The scene at Blackstone Manor was controlled chaos. The beautiful Victorian sleigh sat at an angle on a slope near the eastern boundary wall, one runner buried deep in snow, the other lifted clear of the ground. The horses had been unhitched and stood nearby, their flanks steaming, attended by a stable hand who spoke to them in soothing tones. Thunder and Lightning looked distressed, their ears flicking nervously, sensing that something terrible had occurred. A cluster of people stood at a respectful distance from where Dr. Haydock knelt beside a figure covered by a dark blanket. Police constables were setting up barriers, their young faces solemn with the weight of unexpected tragedy on Christmas morning. A photographer was documenting the scene, his camera clicking softly in the cold air. Inspector Slack, a man whose perpetual skepticism of Miss Marple's insights had softened over years of proven observations, greeted her with grim courtesy. "Miss Marple, appreciate you coming. Nasty business this, especially on Christmas." "What happened, Inspector?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm despite the shock still reverberating through her. "Sleigh tipped going down this slope. Sir Edmund was thrown clear and struck his head on that." He pointed to a snow-covered object near the body. Someone had brushed away enough snow to reveal a Victorian boundary stone, its carved date of 1847 just visible beneath a thin layer of white. The stone stood perhaps 18 inches high, its edges sharp with age, its surface bearing the impact mark where Sir Edmund's head had struck. Miss Marple studied the scene carefully. The slope wasn't particularly steep, perhaps 15 degrees, nothing that should have caused difficulty for an experienced driver with well-trained horses. Yet the sleigh lay on its side, the elegant green and gold paintwork marred by snow and dirt, the crimson velvet seats exposed to the elements. Dorothy Hayes sat in a police car, a blanket around her shoulders, her face pale with shock. She stared straight ahead, seeming to see nothing, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Marcus Webb was having his arm examined by a paramedic, having landed badly when thrown from the sleigh. He winced as the medical professional probed his wrist, but his eyes kept returning to the covered body of his business partner. Thomas Fletcher stood apart from everyone, staring at the overturned sleigh with an unreadable expression. His weathered face showed no emotion, but something in his posture suggested a man carrying an enormous weight. He met no one's eyes, keeping his gaze fixed on the accident scene as though memorizing every detail. Death was instantaneous, de Haydock said quietly, joining Miss Marple and the inspector. Skull fracture from striking the stone. He wouldn't have suffered. Small mercy, that. The doctor looked tired, his Christmas morning disrupted by death in the most unexpected way. He'd been enjoying breakfast with his family when the call came, and had driven to the manor immediately, arriving to find Sir Edmund already beyond any help he could provide. Miss Marple walked slowly around the scene, her sharp eyes taking in details that others might miss. She had a lifetime's experience of observing human nature and the physical evidence of human actions, and both spoke to her now in ways that troubled her deeply. The previous sleigh tracks were visible, showing where 4 earlier groups had passed without incident. The runners had created clear parallel grooves in the snow, following a consistent path along the slope. But this final set of tracks diverged, slightly, running 30 feet to the left of the established path. The deviation was subtle but unmistakable once one knew to look for it. "Why did the route change?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Inspector Slack consulted his notes, flipping back through pages covered in his cramped handwriting. Fletcher says he spotted an icy patch on the usual route during the 4th run, diverted this last group to avoid it for safety reasons, claims he couldn't risk it with Sir Edmund aboard. "I see," Miss Marple murmured, but her tone suggested she saw rather more than the inspector realised. She studied the boundary stone's position, how precisely it aligned with where the left runner had caught, how the tipping motion would have thrown a passenger seated on that side directly toward its unforgiving surface. The geometry of it was almost too perfect, too precisely calculated. She knelt in the snow, ignoring the cold seeping through her coat, and examined the ground around the stone. The impact point was clearly visible, a depression in the snow where Sir Edmund's body had struck. But there was something else, something that caught her attention. The stone itself showed signs of recent disturbance, as though someone had cleared snow away from it, and then carefully replaced the covering. "The other 4 groups took the same path?" she asked, standing and brushing snow from her knees. "According to Fletcher, yes. Same route for all 4 morning rides, including yours. Only changed it for this final run." Slack paused, watching Miss Marple's face. "You're thinking something, aren't you?" Miss Marple looked at Thomas Fletcher, who met her gaze briefly before looking away. In that moment, something in his eyes told her this was no accident, and Christmas morning had witnessed something far darker than festive tragedy. There was knowledge in those eyes, and perhaps guilt, and certainly the recognition that someone had seen beyond the carefully constructed appearance of accident to the reality beneath. "I'm thinking, Inspector, that we should examine this scene very carefully before the snow melts or the weather changes. And I'm thinking that Mr. Fletcher's explanation, while plausible on the surface, deserves closer scrutiny." She turned back to the overturned sleigh, noting the angle of its tipping, the position of the seats, the scatter pattern of the passengers who had been thrown clear. Every detail spoke to her of calculation and planning, of a scene that appeared accidental, but was in fact the result of careful engineering. Someone had transformed a joyful Christmas tradition into a method of execution, and that someone had possessed both the knowledge and the opportunity to do so. Chapter 3. The Inspector's Questions. By early afternoon, Inspector Slack had commandeered Sir Edmund's study for interviews. The room reflected its owner's taste for traditional elegance. Dark wood panelling, leather-bound books lining floor-to-ceiling shelves, a massive mahogany desk that had once belonged to a Victorian statesman. A fire burned in the grate, but its warmth seemed unable to dispel the chill that had settled over the manor. Miss Marple, as a member of the second riding group, was among the first questioned. She described the route precisely, noting every landmark they had passed, every turn Fletcher had made, the smoothness of the ride and the skill with which he had handled the horses. She spoke of the carolling music that had played, the laughter of her fellow passengers, the sheer joy of gliding through a winter wonderland on Christmas morning. "You observed nothing unusual then?" Slack asked, his pen poised over his notebook. "No sign of difficulty with the horses? No indication the sleigh was experiencing any mechanical problems?" "On the contrary, Inspector, I observed everything was entirely usual, which is precisely what makes the final ride's deviation significant." Slack frowned, his heavy brows drawing together. "How do you mean?" "Mr. Fletcher drove 4 groups along the identical route this morning. As estate manager for 25 years, he knows every inch of this land. He would have inspected the route before the rides began, as any responsible person would do. If there was an icy patch dangerous enough to require rerouting, why didn't he identify it during his preliminary inspection? Why did it only become a concern for the final journey, when Sir Edmund himself was aboard?" The inspector's eyes sharpened with interest. "You're suggesting the route change was deliberate, that Fletcher intentionally diverted the sleigh toward that stone?" "I'm suggesting it bears examination," Miss Marple replied carefully. "There are questions that need answering. The timing of the route change, the precision with which the altered path brought the sleigh into contact with the boundary stone, the fact that 4 previous groups travelled safely, while the 5th ended in tragedy." Through the study window she could see the Christmas decorations throughout the manor. The enormous tree in the entrance hall, at least 15 feet tall, glittered with ornaments and lights. Garlands wrapped around the staircase, their evergreen boughs tied with red velvet ribbons. Mistletoe hung in doorways. Everything spoke of celebration and joy, yet death had intruded with brutal finality, corrupting the festive atmosphere into something dark and sorrowful. Dorothy Hayes was interviewed next. The secretary, 48 years old, with greying hair pulled back severely from a thin face, had composed herself since the accident. She sat with perfect posture in the leather chair across from Slack's borrowed desk, her hands folded neatly in her lap, though Miss Marple noticed a slight tremor in her fingers that betrayed inner turmoil. "Sir Edmund was in excellent spirits," she told Slack, her voice controlled and professional despite the circumstances. "He was looking forward to the ride. He always took the final turn himself, said it was the privilege of hosting. He enjoyed being generous, sharing the estate and the sleigh tradition with the village." "Did he express any concerns about the route or the weather conditions?" Slack asked. "None whatsoever. Thomas Fletcher assured us everything was perfectly safe. He'd driven 4 groups already without incident. We had complete confidence in his judgment and skill." Where was Sir Edmund seated in the sleigh? "On the left side, facing forward. It was his customary position. Mr. Webb sat opposite him on the right side. I was beside Mr. Webb, and Thomas drove from the front bench. Sir Edmund liked to have an unobstructed view of the estate as we travelled." "Can you describe what happened when the sleigh tipped?" Dorothy Hayes closed her eyes briefly, reliving the moment. "We were travelling down the slope at a moderate pace, perhaps 15 miles per hour. The ride had been smooth and pleasant. Then suddenly, without warning, the left runner caught on something beneath the snow. The entire sleigh lurched violently to the left. I was thrown against Mr. Webb, who was thrown outward. Sir Edmund was thrown directly left toward the slope. I remember seeing him airborne for a moment, his arms outstretched before he struck the ground, or rather, struck the stone hidden beneath the snow. There was a terrible sound, and then he lay still." Her voice remained steady throughout this recounting, but her hands had tightened in her lap until the knuckles showed white. Miss Marple, watching from her chair near the fireplace where Slack had asked her to remain in case additional questions arose, noted this detail alongside many others. "And Mr. Fletcher, what was his reaction?" "He was thrown forward from the driver's bench but managed to hold onto the reins. He prevented the horses from bolting, which might have made everything worse. Once the sleigh stopped moving, he jumped down and ran to Sir Edmund, but it was immediately clear that nothing could be done." Marcus Webb, nursing a sprained wrist wrapped in bandages, was less composed than Dorothy Hayes. A heavy-set man of 50 with a florid complexion made redder by distress, he seemed genuinely shaken by the morning's events. His hand trembled as he accepted the glass of brandy Slack offered him, and he drank it quickly before beginning his account. "One moment we were gliding smoothly, admiring the view, listening to the carols," Webb said, his voice thick with emotion. "Sir Edmund was pointing out where he planned to plant new trees in the spring. He loved this estate, you know. For all his faults, he genuinely loved the land and took pride in maintaining it. The next moment, chaos. The The sleigh tipped so violently I thought we'd all be killed. Sir Edmund was thrown straight into that damned stone. I landed on my side, wrenched my wrist badly. Dorothy and Fletcher were luckier. They rolled clear without serious injury. Did you notice anything unusual before the sleigh tipped? Any warning sign that something was wrong? Nothing whatsoever. We were travelling at the same speed as the previous rides, by all appearances following the same route. The horses were steady and calm. Thunder and lightning are wonderfully trained animals, you know. Sir Edmund spared no expense on their care and training. Then suddenly the runner caught and everything went wrong so quickly. Mr. Fletcher claimed he altered the route to avoid an icy patch. Did you observe any ice on the original path during earlier rides? Webb frowned, considering. Now that you mention it, no. I was in the first group this morning as well as the last. I rode at 8 o'clock and again at 11:30. The route seemed identical both times until the final journey when Fletcher diverted left. I noticed the change but assumed he had good reason. You didn't question it? Why would I? Fletcher has managed this estate for 25 years. He knows the land better than anyone. If he said there was danger on the usual route, I had no reason to doubt him. Thomas Fletcher's interview was the most revealing and the most troubling. 62 years old, weathered from decades of outdoor work, he spoke with the measured cadence of someone choosing words carefully. He sat upright in his chair, meeting Slack's gaze directly, but Miss Marple noticed how his hands gripped the armrests with barely contained tension. I spotted what looked like exposed ice on the usual route after the fourth group, Fletcher explained, his voice steady but lacking its usual warmth. The sun had been on that section for nearly 2 hours by then, melting the top layer of snow enough to create a potentially slippery surface. Couldn't risk it with Sir Edmund aboard, so I moved the path left by about 30 feet to avoid it. You didn't inspect this ice patch yourself before altering the route? Slack asked, his tone sharpening slightly. No time, Inspector. The schedule was tight, and I judged it safer to use the alternate route rather than delay while I investigated. In my experience, it's better to err on the side of caution. Yet you'd driven 4 groups along that same route without incident. Conditions change, Inspector. Snow melts, ice forms. What's safe at 8 in the morning might be dangerous by 11:30. Any experienced outdoorsman knows that. Were you aware of the boundary stone's location? Fletcher hesitated fractionally, the first break in his composed demeanour. Not specifically. The stone was completely buried under 2 feet of snow. Couldn't see it. Had no reason to think it was there. Miss Marple, listening from her position near the fireplace, noted that hesitation. It was the pause of a man who knew he was about to lie, or at least to speak something less than the full truth. A man who'd managed this estate for 25 years knew where every stone, every marker, every boundary lay. The question was whether he'd forgotten in the moment's decision, or whether he'd known exactly where that stone waited beneath its white disguise, perfectly positioned to execute a plan that had perhaps been weeks in the making. Chapter 4. Miss Marple's Careful Observations. After the formal interviews concluded, Miss Marple requested permission to examine the accident site more closely. Inspector Slack, who had learned over the years to trust her instincts even when he didn't fully understand them, agreed with the stipulation that Constable Perkins accompany her for propriety and safety. The afternoon sun was already beginning its winter descent, casting long blue shadows across the pristine snow. The temperature had dropped further, and Miss Marple's breath formed clouds as she walked slowly along the sleigh's track, her boots crunching in the compacted snow. She moved with deliberate care, studying the ground as though reading a book written in white. She could clearly see where the previous 4 groups had travelled, their paths overlapping to create a well-defined route along the slope. The runners had created deep, parallel grooves, packed down by repeated passage until the snow beneath was almost icy from compression. This was the safe path, tested and proven by multiple journeys. The deviation for the final ride was obvious once one knew to look for it. 30 feet to the left, exactly as Fletcher had stated. But what struck Miss Marple was the precision of that deviation. It wasn't a tentative move to the left, nor a gradual drift. The tracks showed a deliberate turn, executed at a specific point, following a new course that brought the sleigh directly toward where the boundary stone waited beneath its concealing blanket of white. "Constable Perkins," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air, "would you be kind enough to help me clear more snow from around this stone? I should like to see it properly." The young constable, who'd been stamping his feet to keep warm, came forward eagerly. Together they brushed away the white covering with their gloved hands, revealing the full extent of the Victorian marker. It stood approximately 18 inches high, solidly embedded in the earth, its carved inscription recording it as the eastern boundary established in 1847. Someone had taken considerable care with its creation, carving not just the date but also decorative flourishes and the initials of the property owner from that era. The stone was positioned precisely where the altered route would bring the sleigh's left runner into contact with it at speed. Miss Marple knelt beside it, ignoring the cold and dampness seeping through her coat, and examined it with minute attention. The top surface showed a fresh impact mark, still visible despite the snow that had fallen since the accident. And there was something else, something that made her pause and look more closely. Around the base of the stone, the snow had been disturbed, and then carefully smoothed over. Not the natural drift and settle of snow falling from the sky, but the deliberate work of human hands attempting to conceal evidence of recent activity. Miss Marple had spent enough time in her garden observing how snow fell and how it behaved to recognize the difference. She straightened with some difficulty, her hand on her lower back. "Tell me, Constable Perkins, do you notice anything particular about this stone's position relative to the original sleigh path?" The young constable, eager to prove himself useful, studied the scene carefully. He walked back and forth between the stone and the established track, counting paces, comparing angles. "It's well off to the side, ma'am. I'd say at least 30 feet, maybe 35. The normal route would have passed it safely by a considerable distance. No danger at all to the sleigh or passengers." "Exactly so, which means this stone posed no danger whatsoever to the first 4 groups. In fact, they would never have come near it. It only became relevant when Mr. Fletcher chose to alter the route for the final ride. One might almost say it only became deadly when Sir Edmund was aboard." She walked back to the point where the routes diverged, counting her steps carefully. 31 paces from the original track to the stone. Not a random distance, not a panicked swerve to avoid sudden danger, but a precise deviation executed with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going and why. "There's something else that troubles me," Miss Marple continued, more to herself than to the constable. "Mr. Fletcher stated he saw an icy patch on the original route, yet we've had consistent snow since Christmas Eve, with no thaw period that might create ice. The temperature has remained steadily below freezing throughout. Where exactly would this ice have formed?" Constable Perkins looked uncomfortable, caught between his duty to his superior officer and his growing realization that the official explanation didn't quite make sense. "Perhaps from the horse's breath, ma'am? Or maybe water from the manor's gutters had dripped onto the path before the snow fell." "Perhaps," Miss Marple allowed, though her tone suggested she found both explanations unlikely. But if ice had formed from either source, wouldn't Mr. Fletcher have noticed it during his preliminary inspection? Wouldn't he have seen it during the first ride, or the second, or the third? Why only after the 4th group, just in time to divert Sir Edmund's sleigh toward this stone? She knelt again, this time examining the tracks themselves. The sleigh's runners had created deep grooves in the snow, and at the point where the left runner had encountered the buried stone, there was clear evidence of violent impact. The runner had caught on the stone's edge, creating sudden resistance that had tipped the entire vehicle. The physics of it were clear enough, but the intentionality behind it grew more evident with each observation. "Look here, Constable," she said, pointing to the impact point. "See how the runner struck the stone at an angle calculated to maximize the tipping force? A straight-on collision might have simply stopped the sleigh or caused the horses to stumble. But this angle, coming from the right as the sleigh descended the slope, created a rotational force that threw the left side violently upward and forward." "I don't quite follow, ma'am," Perkins admitted. "Imagine a door on hinges," Miss Marple explained patiently. "If you push on it near the hinges, it barely moves. But push on the edge farthest from the hinges, and it swings wide with little effort. The stone acted as a hinge point for the sleigh's left runner. The momentum of the descending vehicle combined with the angle of impact created a violent rotational force. Anyone seated on the left side would be thrown outward and forward with considerable speed, directly toward where this stone stood waiting." She gazed at the stone for a long moment, her mind constructing and reconstructing the sequence of events. "Mr. Fletcher is a skilled driver who knows his horses and his sleigh intimately. He would understand these mechanics instinctively. If one wanted to create an accident that would specifically endanger a passenger on the left side, this is precisely how one would do it. As they walked back toward the manor, Miss Marple paused several times to look up at the house. From several windows, faces watched them with varying expressions. Dorothy Hayes from what appeared to be her office on the second floor, her pale face framed by the window's dark wood. Marcus Webb from a guest bedroom window, his bandaged wrist visible as he lifted it to adjust the curtain. Thomas Fletcher from a ground-floor window near the servants' quarters, his weathered face showing no emotion but his eyes tracking their every movement. Each of them had been on that sleigh when it tipped. Each had survived while Sir Edmund had not. And one of them, Miss Marple was increasingly certain, had known exactly what would happen when Thomas Fletcher diverted the sleigh 31 paces to the left of the safe, established route. The question was whether that person was Fletcher himself, acting alone, or whether others had been complicit in the plan. "Constable," she said as they reached the manor's entrance, "I wonder if you might do me a small favour. Would you be so kind as to ask Inspector Slack whether Mr. Fletcher had surveyed and mapped the estate boundaries at any point during his employment? And if such maps exist, whether they show the precise location of this particular boundary stone?" "Of course, ma'am. Right away." As the young constable hurried off to find his superior, Miss Marple stood in the grand entrance hall, surrounded by Christmas decorations that now seemed grotesquely inappropriate. The massive tree with its hundreds of ornaments and lights, the garlands and ribbons, the mistletoe and holly, all the trappings of celebration in a house where death had come calling on Christmas morning. She thought of Sir Edmund Blackstone, who had hosted these sleigh rides for 15 years, sharing his beautiful estate and his magnificent Victorian sleigh with his neighbours and employees. Whatever his faults, and she suspected he had several based on the reactions she had observed, he had maintained this generous tradition faithfully, and someone had transformed that tradition into a method of execution, corrupting the joy and fellowship of a Christmas morning ride into an instrument of calculated murder. Chapter 5. Secrets of the Estate Sale. That evening, as Miss Marple sat before her fire with a cup of tea, Inspector Slack paid her an unexpected visit. His expression suggested he had uncovered something significant. "You were right to question Fletcher's explanation," he said without preamble. "I've been looking into Sir Edmund's affairs, and there's something everyone at the manor knew but no one mentioned during interviews." "The estate sale?" Miss Marple suggested quietly. Slack's eyebrows rose. "How did you know?" "I didn't know, Inspector, I suspected. Sir Edmund was a wealthy man, but maintaining an estate this size requires enormous capital. At 71, without heirs, it would be natural to consider liquidation. The question is what his plans meant for those dependent on the estate." "Everything, as it turns out," Slack said grimly. "Sir Edmund signed contracts 3 weeks ago with Henshaw Developments. The entire property, all 800 acres, to be sold for £5 million. Transaction completes February 1st. Henshaw plans to demolish the manor and build 140 executive homes." Miss Marple set down her teacup. "And the current residents?" 12 tenant families in tied cottages, 20 staff members including Fletcher, all given notice effective the sale date. Sir Edmund planned to retire to Barbados. He'd already purchased a villa there. "What provision did he make for those displaced?" "Statutory minimums only. Tenant families get 3 months to relocate. Staff receive redundancy payments calculated by years of service. Fletcher, after 25 years, would get roughly £18,000. Dorothy Hayes, after 15 years, approximately 12,000. "That seems rather inadequate," Miss Marple observed. Dorothy Hayes thought so too. "We found a letter in her office addressed to Sir Edmund but never sent. She'd been petitioning him to remember his long-serving staff more generously in his will. Apparently she'd managed his affairs faithfully for 15 years, handling everything from correspondence to investments, and expected to be remembered accordingly." "And was she?" "Sir Edmund's will leaves everything to various charities. Not a single personal bequest. Dorothy had somehow obtained a copy of the will, probably through her access to his papers. She knew she'd get nothing beyond her redundancy payment." "What about Mr. Webb?" Slack consulted his notes. Marcus Webb and Sir Edmund were business partners in property investments. Partnership agreement gave Sir Edmund 90% of profits, Webb 10%. With the estate sale, Sir Edmund planned to dissolve the partnership. Contract allows either party to terminate with 6 months' notice and payment of the minimum contractual obligation, which in Webb's case amounts to £50,000 despite his 15 years as partner and his contribution of initial capital. "Let me guess," Miss Marple said. Mr. Webb felt this was insufficient. He'd consulted a solicitor about challenging the partnership dissolution. The lawyer told him the contract was airtight. Sir Edmund could walk away with millions while Webb got 50,000 and no continuing business relationship. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, watching the fire. And Mr. Fletcher, beyond losing his position, what else does the estate sale mean for him? His tied cottage is slated for demolition. He's lived there for 25 years. At 62, he'll be homeless and unemployed with limited prospects. And that's just Fletcher personally. As estate manager, he knew every tenant family, every employee. The sale would devastate the entire community he'd helped build and maintain. So all 3 passengers had substantial motives to want Sir Edmund dead, Miss Marple observed. Yet only Mr. Fletcher had the means and opportunity to engineer what happened on that slope. Chapter 6. Dorothy Hayes and Marcus Webb. Over the next 2 days, Inspector Slack conducted deeper investigations into Dorothy Hayes and Marcus Webb, searching for any indication either might have conspired with Thomas Fletcher or discovered their own method to murder Sir Edmund. Dorothy Hayes' background revealed a woman of exceptional competence and unwavering loyalty. Orphaned at 20, she had worked her way through secretarial college, establishing a reputation for discretion and efficiency that eventually brought her to Sir Edmund's attention. For 15 years, she had managed every aspect of his complex affairs, from scheduling appointments to overseeing his investment portfolio. Her living quarters at the manor were modest but meticulously organised. Inspector Slack's search revealed files perfectly arranged, correspondence sorted chronologically, financial records maintained with professional precision. He also found a locked diary. The diary entries painted a picture of growing resentment and betrayal. Dorothy had documented every slight, every dismissal of her suggestions, every instance where Sir Edmund treated her as mere staff rather than the trusted partner she felt she'd become. The final entries were particularly bitter. December 10th, discovered by accident that I'm not mentioned in the will. 15 years of dedicated service, and I'm to receive nothing beyond. Statutory redundancy. He remembers the Cats Protection League, but not the woman who's managed his life. December 18th, confronted Essie about the will. He laughed, actually laughed. Said I'd been well compensated with my salary and should be grateful for that. Grateful for being discarded like a worn-out glove. December 23rd. Tomorrow is Christmas Eve. We'll have the sleigh ride on Christmas morning if the snow comes as predicted. Essie is looking forward to it. I wonder if he realises these might be his last days at the manor before he abandons everyone who depended on him. Ominous words, Slack thought, but not proof of murder. Dorothy had been on the sleigh when it tipped. She could easily have been killed herself, unless she'd known exactly where the tipping would occur and how to position herself for minimal injury. Marcus Webb's investigation proved equally suggestive but inconclusive. His business relationship with Sir Edmund had begun with genuine friendship and mutual respect. Webb had provided significant capital for their first property developments, and together they'd built a profitable portfolio. But over the years, Sir Edmund had gradually marginalised his partner's input while maintaining the 90-10 profit split. Slack discovered that Webb had recently experienced serious financial difficulties. His wife's extended illness had required expensive private care. Depleting his savings, he'd borrowed against his share of the partnership, loans that would become due when the partnership dissolved. Without continued income from the business, he faced potential bankruptcy. A visit to Webb's solicitor provided the final piece of his motive. Mr. Webb consulted me about challenging the partnership dissolution, the lawyer confirmed. I advised him he had no legal grounds. Sir Edmund held the controlling interest and the right to terminate. Mr. Webb was quite distressed. He said something I found rather disturbing, that sometimes the only justice available is the kind you make yourself. Miss Marple, when informed of these findings, nodded thoughtfully. Both had excellent motives and the temperament of desperate people, but Inspector, neither had Thomas Fletcher's intimate knowledge of the estate's topography, nor his ability to alter the sleigh's route without arousing suspicion. Chapter 7. The Estate Manager's Secret. Miss Marple requested a tour of Thomas Fletcher's cottage and workshop, which Inspector Slack arranged for the morning of December the 27th. Fletcher, still cooperative despite increasing scrutiny, provided keys and remained on hand to answer questions. The cottage was exactly what one would expect of a lifelong estate manager: functional, comfortable, filled with reminders of a quarter-century spent maintaining Blackstone Manor. Photographs showed Fletcher with various horses over the years, including Thunder and Lightning as foals. Certificates documented his achievements in estate management. A small bookshelf held volumes on land stewardship, animal husbandry, and historical property conservation. His workshop, however, told a different story. The building stood separate from the cottage, a stone structure that had once been a smithy. Fletcher had converted it into a workspace for estate maintenance projects, with benches, tools, and storage for equipment. Everything was orderly, labelled, organised with the same precision Miss Marple had observed in Dorothy Hayes's office. It was this very precision that caught her attention. Among the neatly arranged tools and equipment stood a workbench with a suspicious cleared space, as though something had recently been removed. "Mr. Fletcher," Miss Marple asked pleasantly, "what usually occupies this space on your workbench?" Fletcher hesitated just a fraction too long. "Various projects, Miss Marple. Nothing particular." But beneath the bench, partially concealed by a tarpaulin, Miss Marple spotted something that made her pulse quicken. "Inspector Slack, would you be so kind as to examine what's under that covering?" Slack pulled back the tarpaulin to reveal a scale model of the Victorian sleigh, perhaps 18 inches long, meticulously crafted. It sat on a miniature landscape complete with a sloped section and a small stone marker positioned to the left of a tiny snow-covered path. Fletcher's face drained of colour. "This is remarkably detailed work, Mr. Fletcher," Miss Marple observed. "The sleigh is perfectly proportioned. The landscape appears to represent the eastern boundary area where Sir Edmund died. And unless I'm mistaken, that small stone marker corresponds to the 1847 boundary stone." Slack was already examining the model more closely. "There are measurements here," he said, pointing to markings on the base. "Angles, distances, calculations of some kind." "Physics calculations, I suspect," Miss Marple said quietly. "Mr. Fletcher, would you care to explain what this model was used for?" Fletcher stood silent, his weathered face unreadable. "I think I can deduce its purpose," Miss Marple continued. "You built this to test the dynamics of the sleigh tipping. You calculated the angle of the slope, the speed of the sleigh, the precise position where the runner would catch on the buried stone. You determined that a passenger seated on the left side would be thrown directly toward the stone with sufficient force to cause fatal injury. You engineered Sir Edmund's death with the same care you've applied to estate management for 25 years. "You can't prove any of that from a model," Fletcher said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps not," Slack interjected, "but we can certainly prove you knew exactly where that boundary stone was located. I've examined the estate records. You personally surveyed and mapped every boundary marker 15 years ago. The 1847 stone was marked with a red flag in your survey notes, its position recorded to the inch. You didn't reroute the sleigh to avoid danger, Fletcher. You rerouted it to create a murder that would look like an accident." Chapter 8. The Calculations of Murder. The discovery of the model transformed the investigation. Inspector Slack obtained a warrant to search Fletcher's cottage more thoroughly, and within hours the full extent of his planning became clear. Hidden in a locked drawer of Fletcher's desk were pages of calculations written in his careful hand. Miss Marple, her knowledge of physics limited but her understanding of human planning acute, recognized them as the methodical work of a man who'd left nothing to chance. "These calculations address every variable," Dr. Haydock observed, having been called to interpret the technical aspects: the weight of the sleigh, the weight of 4 passengers with Sir Edmund's position and mass specifically noted, the angle of descent, the speed at which the horses would pull the sleigh down that particular slope. Fletcher even factored in the depth of snow and how it would affect the runner's interaction with the stone. "What about the stone itself?" Slack asked us. "Its height, its position, its composition, all documented." Fletcher calculated the exact point where the runner would catch, and the resulting angular momentum that would tip the sleigh. He determined that Sir Edmund, seated on the left side, would be thrown in a trajectory that would bring his head into contact with the stone at a velocity sufficient to cause fatal skull fracture. Miss Marple examined the dates on the calculations. These were done over several weeks, beginning in early November, just after Sir Edmund announced the estate sale, I imagine. A leather-bound journal provided even more damning evidence. Fletcher had documented his growing desperation as the reality of the sale became clear. Unlike Dorothy Hayes's bitter but passive diary entries, Fletcher's journal showed a man moving from despair to determination to action. November 8th, Essie confirmed today that the sale is proceeding. 800 acres, 12 families, 20 employees, 200 years of history, all sacrificed for his retirement villa in Barbados. He expects us to be happy for him. November 15th, spoke with Henshaw representative who came to survey the property. He showed me the development plans, the manor demolished, the woods cleared, the streams culverted, everything destroyed for identical houses with identical gardens. When I questioned whether this was right, he laughed and said, "Progress doesn't ask permission." November 22nd, cannot accept this. Cannot stand by while SE destroys so many lives for his personal profit. There must be a way to stop him. December the 1st, the Christmas sleigh ride tradition continues regardless of his plans. He always takes the final ride, always sits in the same position. An accident during the ride would be tragic but entirely plausible, especially in heavy snow conditions. The entries that followed documented Fletcher's progression from desperate thought to calculated plan. He researched historical accidents involving horse-drawn vehicles. He studied the physics of tipping and impact forces. He built and tested his scale model, refining the route and the timing until he was confident the outcome would be as intended. December 20th, the weather forecast predicts heavy snow on Christmas Eve continuing through Christmas morning. Perfect conditions. The boundary stone will be completely hidden, and the route deviation will seem a reasonable safety precaution. The physics work. The model confirms it. When the sleigh tips, SE will strike the stone with fatal force while the others will be thrown clear. It will appear to be nothing more than a tragic accident on a festive morning. December 24th. The snow is falling as predicted. By morning there will be more than adequate cover. This is the only way to save the estate and everyone who depends on it. Essie's death will void the sale contract, and the estate will pass to those charities named in his will, who will certainly wish to preserve rather than destroy it. Tomorrow, I end his greed and save our community. Inspector Slack closed the journal with visible disgust. Premeditated murder, documented in his own hand. The man's confession is right here. But Miss Marple looked at the journal with sadness rather than satisfaction. The confession of a desperate man who saw no other way to prevent what he viewed as a greater injustice. Chapter 9. Fletcher's Confession. Thomas Fletcher was formally arrested and cautioned. In the presence of his solicitor, a weary-looking man from the neighbouring town who clearly sympathised with his client's predicament, if not his actions, Fletcher agreed to make a full statement. They gathered in Sir Edmund's study, a room that Fletcher had entered thousands of times during his 25 years of service, but which now felt foreign and hostile. Inspector Slack operated the recording equipment, while Miss Marple sat quietly in the corner, observing. "I don't deny anything in my journal," Fletcher began, his voice steady but tired. "Every word is true. I planned Sir Edmund's death deliberately, and executed that plan on Christmas morning." "Walk us through what you did," Slack instructed. "I surveyed the eastern boundary route the previous week, confirming the boundary stone's position beneath the snow. It was exactly where I'd recorded it 15 years ago during my comprehensive estate survey. I built the scale model to test the physics of the sleigh tipping, calculating the angles and forces required. The model confirmed that rerouting the sleigh 30 feet to the left at that particular point on the slope would cause the runner to catch on the buried stone at sufficient speed to create violent tipping. You knew Sir Edmund would be thrown toward the stone. I knew a passenger, seated on the left side, would be thrown in that direction with considerable force. Couldn't guarantee a fatal outcome, but the calculations suggested severe injury was probable and death was possible. Sir Edmund always sat on the left side facing forward during the sleigh rides. It was his preferred position. What about the other passengers? The The physics indicated they would be thrown away from the stone or would roll with the sleigh's momentum. I calculated their risk of serious injury as minimal. Dorothy Hayes and Marcus Webb suffered minor injuries. I was able to jump clear from the driver's position before the full impact occurred. The supposed icy patch you claimed to be avoiding? Fletcher's expression held something like contempt. There was no ice. I invented that excuse to justify the route change. The temperature had been below freezing for 36 hours. Any competent estate manager would know ice wouldn't form under those conditions. Miss Marple spoke for the first time. "Mr. Fletcher, you transformed a joyful Christmas tradition into an execution method. You used the festive activity and seasonal snow to disguise murder as holiday accident. Did you consider the psychological cost to others? To the villagers who participated in earlier rides, who will now forever associate the Christmas sleigh ride with death? To Dorothy Hayes and Marcus Webb, who might have been killed themselves?" Fletcher met her gaze directly. "I considered everything, Miss Marple, including the cost to 12 families who would lose their homes, 20 employees who would lose their livelihoods, and 200 years of history that would be destroyed for profit. I weighed one man's life against dozens of families and generations of heritage." "That's not your decision to make," Slack said harshly. "Then whose decision is it, Inspector? The legal system that allows a wealthy man to discard people like used equipment? The planning authorities who approve destruction of historical estates for developer profit? I waited for someone else to stop him. No one did." His solicitor placed a hand on his arm, but Fletcher continued. "My only regret is that Sir Edmund's death was instantaneous. He felt no pain, experienced no suffering. The families he planned to evict will suffer for months, perhaps years. The employees he planned to discard will struggle to find new positions. The community he fractured will take generations to repair. His death was quick. The destruction he planned would have been agonizingly slow." The room fell silent, except for the sound of the recording equipment. Finally, Slack switched it off. "Thomas Fletcher, you're charged with the murder of Sir Edmund Blackstone. You'll be remanded in custody pending trial." As Fletcher was led away, Miss Marple remained in her chair, her expression troubled. The case was solved, the murderer identified and confessed, but the victory felt hollow. Justice had been served in the legal sense, yet the underlying injustice that drove Fletcher to murder remained unaddressed. Chapter 10. Miss Marple's Reflection. 3 days after Fletcher's arrest, Miss Marple sat in her cottage by the fire, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she reflected on the case. Inspector Slack had stopped by for tea, seeking her perspective on what had become a media sensation, the estate manager who murdered his employer to prevent an estate sale. "The newspapers are having a field day," Slack said wearily. "Half portray Fletcher as a monster who killed for money, the other half as a tragic hero fighting against corporate greed. Neither version is quite right." "Human beings resist simple categorization," Miss Marple observed. "Mr. Fletcher is both a murderer who planned and executed a killing with cold calculation and a devoted steward who genuinely believed he was protecting his community. The two truths coexist uncomfortably. The tenants and employees have started a legal defence fund for him, raised £30,000 already. They're calling him a martyr for their cause." Miss Marple's needles paused. "And what's to become of the estate sale?" "That's the ironic part. Sir Edmund's death did void the contract with Henshaw Developments. The estate passes to the charitable trust named in his will. The trustees have indicated they plan to preserve the manor as a historical property and continue the tenancy arrangements. Fletcher achieved his goal. The estate and its community are saved." "At the cost of Sir Edmund's life and Mr. Fletcher's freedom," Miss Marple said quietly. "Hardly a victory." Slack sipped his tea thoughtfully. "What troubles me most is that Fletcher isn't wrong about the system failing these people. A wealthy man could destroy dozens of lives legally, with no recourse for those affected. That doesn't justify murder, but it explains the desperation that drove a decent man to such an act." "The Christmas sleigh ride," Miss Marple murmured, "was meant to be a celebration of community, tradition, and seasonal joy. Sir Edmund transformed it into a symbol of his ownership and generosity, using the tradition to display his wealth and position. Thomas Fletcher then corrupted it further, weaponizing the festive activity to deliver Sir Edmund to his calculated death. Both men, in their different ways, betrayed what the tradition should have represented." She resumed her knitting, the pattern emerging with each careful stitch. The tragedy extends beyond Sir Edmund's death or Fletcher's imprisonment. It encompasses all those who rode the sleigh that Christmas morning in innocent joy, unaware they were participating in a carefully orchestrated execution. It includes the villagers who will forever associate the holiday tradition with violence and deception. The snow that should have brought only beauty and wonder became the concealing blanket for murder. "What sentence do you think Fletcher will receive?" Slack asked. "Life imprisonment, I imagine, though the circumstances may argue for some consideration. The premeditation works against him, but the jury may have sympathy for his motives, if not his methods." Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked directly at the inspector. "The real question is whether anything will change. Will this case prompt examination of how easily the wealthy can disrupt entire communities? Or will Fletcher simply be imprisoned while the system that drove him to desperation continues unchanged?" Slack had no answer to that. As evening fell over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat alone with her thoughts. The village Christmas decorations still twinkled in windows, but the festive spirit had been dampened by the events at Blackstone Manor. The Victorian sleigh sat in storage, its future uncertain. Thunder and lightning had been sold to a neighbouring estate where, one hoped, they might pull a sleigh again under happier circumstances. She thought of Thomas Fletcher in his cell, a man who had spent 25 years nurturing and protecting an estate, only to destroy his own life in a desperate attempt to save it. She thought of Dorothy Hayes and Marcus Webb, who had also suffered under Sir Edmund's selfishness but had not resorted to murder, and who now must live with the knowledge that they rode in the death sleigh, unwitting participants in Fletcher's plan. Most of all, she thought of Sir Edmund Blackstone himself, a man who had provided a beloved Christmas tradition for 15 years, who had restored a magnificent Victorian sleigh and opened his estate to villagers for their annual celebration. Yet this same man had planned to destroy that same community for personal profit, unable or unwilling to see beyond his own desires to the lives he would devastate. The Christmas morning sleigh ride had ended not in joyful return to the manor house, but in death on a snowy slope. The lesson, if there was one, seemed to be that even the most beautiful traditions could become instruments of destruction when human nature, in its complexity and darkness, corrupted their purpose. Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm. Stitch by stitch, pattern by pattern, order emerged from chaos. If only human affairs could be managed so neatly, she thought, but people were not wool, and life was not a pattern that could be controlled with needles and careful planning. The case of the Christmas morning sleigh ride was closed, but its questions would linger long after Thomas Fletcher's trial concluded, and St. Mary Mead returned to its usual quiet rhythms. Some mysteries, Miss Marple reflected, were solved in the courtroom, but remained forever unresolved in the human heart. The end.